lovelies, my name is Stephanie and welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here then welcome. My name's still Stephanie, but welcome to the channel, welcome to the family, glad to have you here. So if you haven't already seen the video on Chloe's channel, which I mean, how dare you, it's linked just above, please go and watch that immediately. We were talking about the best things about Pride Month over on her lovely channel, so please go and check it out. And because we're cynical people and we hate everything, we're talking about the worst things about Pride Month on my channel. So please welcome back for the third time on my channel, the Chloe Connection.
Hi, thanks for having me, Stephanie.
You're welcome. You're so welcome. Welcome back. Thank you so much for coming back and doing another collaboration with me during Pride Month. This like best and worst thing between us is becoming kind of our thing and I'm really enjoying it. I'm not gonna lie. It's very fun. It's also very important to note that it's very warm in both England and America. So if we start perspiring during these videos, we're sat in front of like lights and in hot, I'm in a jumper because I make terrible decisions. So that's why that's happening. So don't worry too much about that either. So there you go. So I suppose let's just dive straight into the video, and because it's my channel and Chloe is of course my lovely and highly esteemed guest, I will hand over to Chloe for the first point of the worst things about Pride Month.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. It'd be my honor to kick this off. I like to say, we don't perspire, we just glisten, because we are beautiful creatures.
Sparkling.
Yes. But our first point of the worst things about Pride Month is rainbow washing, corporate pride, companies co-opting pride, whatever you want to call it, but basically like June 1st rolls around and all these companies are like, rainbows, cool, we support you, we love you, and then July 1st and it's like crickets chirping. And this happens every year. For a lot of major companies it's been happening every year for at least a few years now, because I think companies realize that it's safe or trendy to support the community now. And I think, you know, it's great, you know, to see companies just saying positive things about LGBT people, like, but I think the problem with that is for most of these companies, it's really about making money off of us, like selling rainbow-themed products or whatever pride flag-themed products you can think of, which is cool. It's cool to buy, but it's like the money kind of ends there. They're profiting off of us, our identities, our experiences, and a lot of times that money is not being put to making actual change, to like actually improve our rights. Which I think that's, at least for me, that's where a lot of the issue comes from. That it's about profit and it's not about like advancing legislation to help LGBT people. It's not to say there aren't companies out there who are doing help, it just seems the majority are not very helpful. Really, I guess the way I'd sum it up is, from a lot of these companies, the words feel very shallow and hollow and there's not a lot of weight behind them.
Yeah, and it's, I think, you know, I mean, you kind of hit the nail on the head there, but I think one of the things as well is their complete lack of acknowledgement and understanding in a lot of these companies' parts that they played within like certain moments in anti-LGBT history. You know, you see some companies that years ago probably would have contributed to the anti-LGBT as it was fashionable to be anti-LGBT then, who are now pro-LGBT and kind of rainbow washing and profiting from our kind of iconography, and not addressing the parts that they played, not addressing our history in doing so. They kind of, especially nowadays with kind of rainbow washing and things like that, there's a lot of focus on the modern community, which is great because obviously, I mean, we're part of the modern community, you know, that's who we are, but it also doesn't pay tribute or pay homage to our kind of heritage in terms of how much we had to fight and how far we had to come to be able to be the people we are, wear rainbows proudly, you know, and all of those things. And so to see companies kind of taking over our symbolism is very, I guess in a way it just feels very corporate and very kind of consumerist, that it's just another opportunity to kind of benefit from a kind of segregated community from the kind of stereotypical cis-het community. And I think that a way to combat that, especially in terms of like buying merchandise and things like that, is kind of going to small queer artists representing queer companies, or companies who genuinely feed back into the community. You know, it's great to buy a £5 kind of rainbow flag, but especially now that there's such a push on sustainability, finding a queer artist that you can support individually, giving them maybe a little bit more than you think you should have to give them, but because it's benefiting them, you kind of are giving back to your own community as well. Like, I think there are definitely ways around rainbow washing in terms of how we support and uplift our community ourselves.
Absolutely. I love everything you said. I mean, I hate that it exists, but I agree with you on all these points. And I think even just to touch again on that point of like these companies, some that say they're supportive now but weren't supportive in the past, like there's even a lot of companies today that will say they support us during Pride Month, but then their money might go to actively to politicians and initiatives that are anti-LGBT the very next month. And it's just like, well, more of your money is going to stuff that's against us and you're profiting off of us, and it's just kind of the same cycle over and over and over.
And I think it should just be like, you know, that push for people who genuinely want to give back to the community to like actually put the work in and kind of figure out, you know, find out the company you're buying from, you know, what's the history of the rainbow flag? Why are you buying the rainbow flag? What's the history of the trans pride flag? Where does it come from? What's the struggle associated with it? You know, if you want to support our community and support it in the right way, then do your research. Don't just find the first kind of LGBT flag on Amazon, a company notoriously known for giving to corporations, charities, and people who are quite notoriously anti-LGBT. So yeah, it's just do your research, you know, take some time. You don't have to rush into buying a rainbow flag without knowing kind of where it's going and the communities that it will affect. So moving on to our next point, kind of the next kind of worst thing about Pride Month, and this is something we've mentioned in a couple of our videos before, because it kind of is relevant to every faction of like the best and worst elements of a lot of things within the community. But especially during Pride Month, one of the absolute worst things is segregation within our own community. Now this can be based on a number of factors. So what we mean by this is not segregation from the kind of cis-het community, but segregation within our own factions, the like lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, you know, intersex, asexual, all of those things. It's the segregation within those segregated communities. So in the gay community, the segregation between kind of race, the segregation between cis-het passing, the segregation between size, so things like twink and bear and plus size and things like that, you know, and there's segregation like that within every facet of the LGBT community. And what's really startling to me is that although Pride Month is a huge month of celebration within our community, it also seems to be when all of the kind of roaches come out of the woodwork, and you see a lot more of the like internalized transphobia, internalized biphobia, internalized, you know, queerphobia in general within the communities from other people within our community, especially things like racial prejudice within the queer community and fat phobia within the queer community, being ableist within the queer community and things like that. So the segregation in the LGBTQ plus community during Pride Month just feels much more prevalent, I suppose, because we have such a larger platform during Pride Month that it just becomes much more noticeable to everyone within the community that there is segregation within our community. We are like a kind of tiny little community, like, well, we're not tiny, there's so many of us, but in terms of like the global population, in terms of being a community, we're so much smaller than the global population, but there's still hyper increased kind of amounts of prejudice in our own factions.
Yeah, and you know, something I mentioned before we started recording is like I feel like our community is just a microcosm of our society. So like a lot of these problems, a lot of these social issues that we see in a lot of areas, they show up in our community too, because I mean at the end of the day we're all people and people are imperfect and some people can be quite terrible. And I think if your image of roaches coming out of the woodwork is very visceral. And I think if we think about like in terms of identity and privilege, like we can see that a lot of Pride Month will revolve around those with the most privilege. Not that, you know, gay, cis, white men are inherently bad people, but, you know, the people that have the most privilege, the people that are the closest to, you know, cishet passing or the closest to what is deemed accessible in society are going to be the people that are going to be more accepted, more forefront in a lot of areas of Pride, at least more mainstream, more visible aspects of Pride Month. You know, so we see that segregation between, you know, cis gay white men and a lot of other populations, whether it's queer and trans people of color, whether it's lesbians, whether it's just trans people in general, whatever it may be. You know, we'll also see segregations between quote-unquote passing trans people and trans people that quote-unquote don't pass. You know, because there's that stigma. Sometimes people who are very much passing may not want to associate with people who don't pass, which is a terrible thing, but it happens all the time. And then all the problems that we have the other 11 months of the year show up too. Things like biphobia, you know, misunderstandings of asexual people. Like, we don't really see, I haven't really seen much representation at all of really anything beyond like LG, a little bit of T, which is nice. And I guess queer broadly.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, like, queer as an umbrella term sees a lot of representation, but if you break it down into the individual labels, bearing in mind that queer kind of encompasses people who also don't have necessarily labels, like, if you broke it down into the smaller factions, queer would have almost no representation. It seems to be in Pride that it is primarily the lesbian and gay communities which get the most attention, and obviously we've seen in the last kind of 5 years roughly there's been a lot more attention towards the trans community, but it does feel like the bisexual community and the kind of smaller elements of the queer community and the questioning community do just get completely overlooked, which is just another part of that kind of increased segregation that me and Chloe are talking about.
Yeah, and I guess another thing I've seen a lot of conversation about this year, and it's probably happened in past years too, is just like, where does kink fit into in Pride? And there's a lot of kink shaming from all communities. And there's a lot of like conversations about like Pride needs to be family friendly. But, you know, the history of that term family friendly has been applied to LGBTQ plus people broadly, usually by more conservative groups, basically overly sexualizing and demonizing queer and trans people. So, you know, it's like, oftentimes we end up using the same oppressive language that we've been oppressed with against other parts of the community, and we don't even realize it because we just internalize a lot of it.
Yeah, and it's all so circumstantial because a lot of it is being kind of brought up with things like that, you know, and it's that debate of, you know, pride is a celebration of sexuality, but that doesn't necessarily equate to gender identity and things like that. So when people are like, oh, pride needs to be family friendly, and people's arguments are, yes, but pride's a celebration of sexual identity and children shouldn't have a sexual identity, it's like, well, that kind of completely disregards and invalidates all of the parts of the queer community that is gender identity related, which is relevant in all stages of life, not just sexual development and sexual attraction and things like that. So yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you that also has a huge part to play in terms of like, does kink fit in, doesn't it fit in, you know, should children be allowed at pride, shouldn't children be allowed at pride, and things like that. And it's like, because pride is so fixated and focused on the L and the G communities, it seems to completely disregard the elements of pride that are about identity and not sexuality.
I'm sure we could keep going on this point, but in the interest of time...
In the interest of time, we're going to move on from this point because this is something we could talk about for a very long time. So the next point is Chloe's.
Our third point, and there's definitely some overlap with the point we just talked about, but our third point is, you know, with Pride Month, we see typically a lot of increased visibility for various identities in the community, but with that can also come increased hate, prejudice, homophobia, transphobia, and intersections of racism, you know, ableism, fat phobia, you name it, just because it's kind of like we're more visible and people may use that as like, it's like we're an easier target than we were before. So, yeah, you know, people can use that as an excuse to be like, oh, I can see all these people coming out on the internet, all these people coming out in person, and I can be hateful, and it's easy. And yeah, we see that a lot. I've heard a lot of people experiencing increased hate on YouTube. I mean, that's nothing new to be experiencing anti-LGBT hate on YouTube or any social media, but it tends to be the trolls come out in full force in June.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it probably comes from the fact that, like, as a community, we maybe don't necessarily celebrate ourselves in the same way that the cisgender community does, and we don't necessarily feel comfortable celebrating ourselves year round, but in June, it kind of is like a community collective permission to celebrate yourself and elevate yourself, and I think that phobic people just don't know how to deal with that increased and heightened pride. And in terms of that, like, obviously we should be proud year round, but then I suppose we just experience the same level. Like, it wouldn't be compartmentalized into a 30-day period. It would just be like, we experience hate year round, but it would be on a kind of a bigger level. So I suppose it just comes from the fact that June as a month is just a celebration for our community, and prejudiced people don't necessarily know how to deal with people who are different, celebrating their differences and not conforming to their ideals of what humans, which is the base level of what humans should be and strive towards.
Yeah, and putting, you know, should obviously in quotes.
Should.
Yeah. Because, I mean, I think a lot of it can go back to, like, among many other things, this classic fear of things you don't understand, fear of the unknown, and with increased visibility of things you don't know or things that make you uncomfortable for whatever reason, there's increased pushback. I mean, we've seen that a lot in the trans community, as Stephanie mentioned, you know, in the past probably 6 or 7 years, we've gotten more visibility in the trans community, but that has also come with, you know, some increases in rights, but also a lot of backlash as well, because it's kind of like, oh, we can kind of just hide among the woodwork, and then, you know, gradually we come together and able to come out, and people are like, oh, here's all these problems we didn't know existed, and we're gonna make them problems, and happens every year. But I just want to say, for any of you out there that do have like a negative gut reaction when seeing like anything LGBTQ plus related, I think take a moment to just ask yourself, like, why are you having that negative gut reaction, and figure out where that's coming from, rather than, you know, leaning into the gut instinct of maybe lashing out or saying something mean or doing something hurtful. You know, ask yourself, like, what is that reaction about, and see if there's any way you can address that.
Try not to use our pride as an excuse to lean into your own ignorance, you know, and the thing is, I think as people, you know, me and Chloe, we're people like everyone else. We're flawed. I mean, me more so than her, but we're flawed people, you know, we're not perfect. And so we understand and empathize with the idea of fear of the unknown. I mean, I know I'm speaking for myself, or I don't know if I'm speaking for Chloe, but before I started my transition, I was terrified of being a trans person, terrified of revealing my identity and things like that. And that was fear of the unknown, fear of the inexperienced. But don't allow your ignorance or your background or the way you've been raised or the kind of systemic kind of prejudice that you've been brought up with to allow yourself to lean into that kind of knee-jerk reaction of, I should preach hate rather than expose myself to the knowledge that would let me see that this is actually a brilliant community, that there are actually huge strides being made, and that there is real strength within queer people. So, you know, even if this video helps one person who maybe has a few prejudiced bones in their body go out and educate themselves in terms of what it means to be a queer person, then that's a win. You know, that is a one less person that we have to deal with. But yeah, so just don't let yourself think that us celebrating our identity in any way diminishes your own, because that's not why we do it. We do it to raise our own station, to raise our own celebrations, to raise our own flags, you know, so use it as a platform to launch yourself into the pursuit of knowledge, as opposed to launch yourself into an anonymous tirade of unnecessary hate speech on the internet. Yay. So the next kind of worst thing about Pride Month is how it's been appropriated to a point where it no longer remembers, reflects, or pays homage to our history. Obviously, I mean, people have been fighting for queer rights for much longer than Stonewall and things like that, and all of those kind of pivotal points within queer history. But it bothers me that Pride today isn't always necessarily a celebration of our history. It's something we touched upon briefly before when I spoke about kind of, you know, rainbow washing and things like that, and it's the fact that Pride as a celebration is great, and it's brilliant to celebrate yourself during Pride and to elevate our community, but Pride wasn't always a celebration. Pride was a struggle. Pride was activism. Pride was people being abused or being victims of murder or all of these things. So being proud and choosing to be proud used to be a protest. It used to be a protest of the law. It used to be a protest of oppression. It used to be a protest of so many things. And I think one of the absolute worst things about Pride Month is that too few people know the history and too many people don't care to know. They don't want to know what Stonewall was. They don't want to know who the trailblazers were that came before us. They don't want to know that the cis het conforming white gay male community owes their rights and privileges to black trans and queer women. Do you know what I mean? There's not that desire to pay attention and reflect on our history as a community. So I think that's definitely, I mean, one of the points I feel most passionate about is the complete neglect of our history as queer people during Pride Month.
Yeah, absolutely. Just like the whitewashing of Pride, the cis-washing of Pride, the corporatizing of Pride, as we've talked about. And, you know, I want to emphasize we're not saying that there aren't people out there who do remember the roots. There are people out there who do celebrate the roots, who do, you know, still use Pride as a protest, not just during Pride Month, but being proud and visible at any time of the year. It's just, you know, for many people, I think Pride has turned more into a party than a protest. And I think it's okay to enjoy, like, the fun parties that can come with Pride, but not at the expense of remembering the reasons why Pride exists in the first place. You know, Stephanie mentioned Stonewall. You know, it's important to know all the things that came after Stonewall, like the Gay Liberation Front, or the organization STAR that was started by Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. Like all these things that were started by predominantly queer and trans women of color. And it's interesting, you know, all these foundations were created by predominantly women of color, but still we're at a point where Pride privileges mostly white gay cis men. It's just this aspect of privilege that people who do the most work and lay the foundations are usually the ones that are overlooked by the very movements that they start. And, you know, realizing that Stonewall was a big turning point, but that's not where it began either. You have to remember things like riots in the Compton cafeterias, riots at Cooper's Donuts, like all these things that happened before, the Mattachine Society, all these organizations that kind of paved the way that turned into that powder keg, so to speak, that is Stonewall. And then all the years of, you know, movements largely neglecting anybody but mostly gay men, lesbian women, and taking until probably like the 90s, 2000s before trans people were even considered in like mainstream like pro-LGBT organizations. And it's easy to forget these things now because there is more acceptance. Obviously things are far from perfect, especially depending on where you live and how you identify, but you know, we don't want to neglect why people before us have had to do what they did to get to where we are today, for the progress that we've made. And we also don't want to become complacent and think that there is no more progress needed to be made.
Yeah, it kind of, I mean, to really kind of, I guess, dumb it down, it kind of feels like Pride and queer rights was that class project that was assigned to a group of many people, and then one person did all the work, but everyone got all of the credit, and then that one person just got forgotten in the background, despite the fact they did all the work. Like, I think as well as trans women, it's different for us because our view is probably slightly biased, and when I say slightly, probably more than slightly biased, because so many of those rights and privileges, like Chloe said, came from trans women of colour, women of trans experience of colour, you know, these factions of the community that are so neglected now. You know, I mean, the age expectancy for trans women is incredibly low because of the amount of crime and prejudice towards trans women of colour and things like that, and yet we owe so many of our rights and privileges to those women who laid the foundations. And, you know, even throughout history, pivotal characters and rebels who, you know, clearly made a huge kind of point to notice all of those things. So yeah, it just, yeah, I mean, it's one of the worst things about Pride Month. Absolutely one of the worst. But you can do so much more for your community by going out and celebrating those people and choosing to educate yourself and choosing to educate others, and to live proudly, but also to remember those before you who lived proudly, sometimes at the expense of their own lives, in order for you to be afforded the opportunity to do those things that they never could. So So the next point and the last point of the video is Chloe's, and just before we kind of move into all of these points, I just really wanted to kind of say that this video isn't to say that pride is a negative thing. It's not. We love pride. We love being proud. We love living openly and all of those things, but it's just a video to address the fact that with all of the pros, there are a lot of cons. There are a lot of elements of Pride Month that don't necessarily reflect the best of us as a community, and also it just inflates other people's sense of self when kind of delivering prejudice towards us as a community. So please don't take this video as us like bashing Pride Month. We love Pride Month, but we just, I think, needed to take some time to address the fact and talk about the fact that there are problems during Pride Month externally and internally from our own communities about these things that happen. So without further ado, Chloe, what is the last point?
Yeah. Pride, like most things, is not perfect. So yeah, our last point, we've touched on this a little bit already, but you know, we mentioned Pride Month often comes with increased visibility, increased media coverage, but with that we can also have increased negative visibility, increased negative media coverage, and almost this increased pressure that's placed on the community, like this all eyes are on us. It's Pride Month, everybody's looking at the LGBTQ plus community, whether it's like corporations looking at each other to see who can out corporate pride the other, and it's just like, you're missing the whole point, or just people, you know, putting us on a pedestal or expecting us to be like model minorities or whatever it may be, putting all the attention on, you know, LGBTQ plus people. And like a lot of things, it can set up marginalized people for failure, putting all eyes on us, especially those who are most marginalized within the LGBTQ plus community.
Yeah, it's just, you know, again, leading into that heightened celebration, heightened prejudice. There is heightened coverage, good and bad, and it can put us as a community kind of feels like best behavior in a way, like we have to not mess up at all and not be human because we know that media will twist it and use it against us. So definitely one of the worst things that you'll see the most of is the negative press and coverage and negative feelings towards the community that have heightened press and things like that. Like it is a double-edged sword. You know, there is heightened positive press, like we mentioned in Chloe's video, but there is heightened negative press as well. So yeah, I mean, I don't know about everybody watching. I don't know how you feel about Pride Month. Pride Month is so important and so pivotal to who we are as a community because we're so segregated and beaten down and historically ridiculed and abused and all of these things, and it's so important. And eventually I'd love to walk towards a future where Pride Month isn't necessary, but I think that Pride Month as a celebration of our history will always be necessary. And I mean, it's a privilege that me and Chloe both share to live openly, and we owe that to the people who came before us. So we hope by highlighting the worst things about Pride Month and the things that happen during Pride Month which don't reflect the best of our community, we are educating someone out there who maybe had started to see these things but didn't necessarily equate them, who will take something away from this video in order to go and do better. And I mean, the hope with all of my videos is that, you know, someone learns something from it, but I hope that in this video it heightens your awareness of the bad things that do happen during Pride Month, and that in some way myself and Chloe have inspired you to go off, educate yourself, not lean into ignorance, not only focus on the negative media coverage, but know that there will be heightened amounts of negative media coverage, like all of those things. And yeah, I mean, I guess that's it in terms of this video, in terms of the worst things about Pride Month. Like we said, Pride Month is a celebration and so important. Please enjoy your Pride Month, please enjoy it safely, please pay homage to the people who came before us. Chloe, do you want to say anything? Do you want to say bye?
I mean, yes. Yeah, I don't have a whole lot else to add, just I second everything you just said. And I think, again, it is important to reiterate that Pride Month is a beautiful, important time for so many of us in the community. It's just important to, keep these things in mind, keep in mind the positive things, but also consider some of these things that still aren't nearly as good as they should be. And just, keeping in mind that, again, like most things, Pride Month is a imperfect thing. And, respect and love the beauty in it, but also don't overlook the imperfections and issues that exist, and be part of the process of making Pride better, more inclusive, more thoughtful, more integrated into our communities and our history.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I couldn't have put it any better. So we hope that you loved this video. Please comment down below anything that you want to comment, like, subscribe, all of those things. Go over to Chloe's channel and watch the best things about Pride Month. I highly recommend that after watching this video because it will cheer you up. But yeah, thank you so much to Chloe for being here again. It was lovely to have you.
So lovely to be here. Every video I get to do with you is pure joy, even when the subject is not.
Love that. We love doing these videos, so make sure you drop a comment as well about the next best and worst topic you would like to see us cover, and I will see you guys next week for a brand new video. Bye!
Bye!